This is a future edit. The amount of VN releases are kind of crazy this month. I'm putting this out first because Shinjuku Somei is coming out in the later half of May, and he wrote Winter Polaris, which is what I'm doing now. But outside of that, Amazing Grace came out, and I heard that was pretty good. Ganhiro's Fantiel just came out recently too, alongside like Mashido coming out like I think in a couple of days or maybe next week, I forgot. And that's from like Palette I think, which made another title that I wasn't really into, but hey, the art looks good, maybe I'll try it out. It's very expensive I think is what it's going to be because the sales going to be crazy for that marketing thing you can do, and it works, but I guess I'll just skip it for now. There's even Tokyo Psychodemic coming out around like the same time as Somei, and that was also something I wanted to read. It's like holy shit, it's so packed. Anyways, Aoi Tori just came out today, I think, and that's probably going to be the in-between title from this one right now and the Somei one. My backlog keeps increasing, and actually my drafts are piling up, so I might actually be able to play like 100 Heroes and the Labyrinth Meister instead of like a video coming out every month, so that's kind of cool, I guess. But holy shit, there's so much. This time around, it's a combo of two titles. I did this a few times, depending if what I got to say for one isn't enough for like a large-ass video. One is Marco and the Galaxy Dragon, and the other one is Winter Polaris. Both of them can be summed up with just like, oh well, that's an experience with both its tone and how they're paced. It's just that they're both in opposite sides of the spectrum. Basically, Winter Polaris focuses more on tone and the writing. It takes its time to get anywhere, and you just enjoy the atmosphere of it all. It has a lot of backdrops and tracks, but you're basically just paying for the writing. Marco's bombastic with their pacing and their budget, and yet little word for the plot. The plot also takes a backseat for the characters for both of them, and they're all pretty short, and they can all be finished in like 4 to 5 hours, maybe 6 at the most. Technically, this one was gonna have like Slay the Princess as well, where it was like, oh, it's a happy medium of the two. It's just that I wrote so much about that one and it became like its own thing. I'll go through both without the spoilers, and then there's probably timestamps already, and you'll see, oh, like this is when I talk about shit, and that's like the longer parts. Winter Polaris is interesting, but how it's told is rather dry, and that's kind of a common occurrence with like Karaoke's titles of what I've read anyway. Even the later ones like A Christmas Tina still has a decent bit of that. There's parts where it feels like you're just crawling to get to the next part, and that's not even a bad thing. It's like, it's the whole mood, and he sets it up well. It's probably what I find he does best, and Winter Polaris is split in like into two plots, Sweeper Swimmer and Winter Polaris. Sweeper Swimmer is about two people finding something unusual to them, and they go off sailing to find like, oh, what's it's actually about. Winter Polaris is about an epidemic and that's wiping out humanity, but instead of death, they're basically just vanishing. And there's more to each plot, but that's all spoilers. And you know, they'll eventually intermingle a bit, but you'll get to it. The VN being split into two sections is both a good and bad thing. Sweeper Swimmer is written by someone else, and it's a decent breather for Winter Polaris. The problem is you could technically remove like a huge chunk of it, and it wouldn't technically ruin like Winter Polaris. I think the idea was that they were mostly written separately anyway to begin with. It also doesn't help that these two sections aren't really piecemealed all that well. You can do like 4 parts of Winter Polaris and then you're just blocked off until you get around to Sweeper. It was kind of annoying at times because you're already invested in one of them and now you're like, well, fuck off. And now you're not in the greatest mood of all because like, alright, now I'm in this one, I'm already in a bad mood, it's awful. It's still well written, so you'll get over it like after like 10 minutes, but it just could have been segmented better. The art is mainly backdrops. It's kind of a thing with a lot of his titles that I've read. Everything is set to like the mood and it keeps you trapped in there, and what's around is pretty, but you're just not going to get a lot of it. Overall, it's a good read, but by the end, what's happening in the world isn't all that important. It's heavily like character focused. It has a huge listless vibe and how sometimes you need a push here and there to keep on going. Basically, they're just tired of what's happening to them and they just lost their way. I give it around an 8 in terms of like writing and tone, but it's close to a 7 to do the plot split, but even then, it was still pretty fun as a standalone. It's one of those things where if around 80 to 90% of each path was unlocked by each other, it would have been like a strong 8. The plot has a lot going for it, but you can say there's like 3 plots going on at once, and one of the initial ones just gets shoved to the side. And you know, to you, maybe that's the most interesting one, maybe it wasn't at all, then it doesn't really matter to you. It's that kind of thing. Karaoke also has like a new title coming out pretty soon, so I'm excited for that. It's called Shinjuku Somei. I'm pretty sure it got delayed to like May now. In contrast to Winter Polaris, Marco felt like it was written by like a crackhead at gunpoint and the deadline wasn't 10 minutes. This title screams two things: it's wacky and it's massive budget. Tone of the title almost screams Kusoge, but it has so much passion and work slapped on it. It's like, alright, it's still fun. It's got like 63 tracks, and it feels like it has like 800 CGs. Sure, a good number of them just felt like alternates of each other's, but even then it still feels like there's around 500 of them. You get a new CG like every minute in the beginning, sometimes a new one after like a couple of lines. Put in perspective, the total CG count for a normal like 30-hour VN wouldn't even cover the first hour of Marco. It even slapped in some little animations in between, and it really feels like those office memes games where they're sending the rest of their budget because they just lose it otherwise. On the other hand, the plot feels completely rushed and sometimes unfinished. You can throw out around like a third of the cast and it wouldn't change much of anything. It's still a fun time, but you're not going to hear any praise on the plot from me. An easy example is giving like a 13 episode anime, but only 5 of those episodes had any importance at all. It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure that's exactly what happened with the DMC one. The finale was fine, but that's based on the chemistry between all the characters more so than the plot. And I think that was kind of the point of the title, where nothing is all that important. It's just getting your ass outside, meeting new people, and doing new shit with them before going on your way for your next adventure. So a good chunk of it is like mindless nonsense, but it's designed to be that way. Overall, in terms of like an experience, I give it like around a 7, maybe even an 8 if you read like a decent chunk of VNs already, because it becomes closer to like a Fooly Cooly back in the day, where the stark contrast of what you're used to in anime, and it makes it pretty cool in its own regard. I think most of my fun with this title was just with the absurdity of how many CGs get slapped on the screen. In terms of plot, it's like a 4. The tone and the energy is consistent, it's just consistently bonkers. The pacing is going through supersonic speeds, and the plot is just set up to get all these characters moving, because the story that beats themselves just feels like it just gives me huge whiplash. These are going to be the spoilers now. It's going to be more all over the place and just nitpicks here and there. For Winter Polaris' whole setting of like, oh, all of humanity is disappearing, that's just not really used all that much. It's a setup for the third plot where there's a minuscule amount of immortals around the world. They generally try to stick by themselves, but there's times where they all group up but eventually disperse anyway. There seems to be a limit where they just want off themselves. We don't know if it's a common trait in them. It was only shown once, but it was told that this guy met like a whole lot more of these immortals in previous eras. And all of them might also found ways to like end their lives as well, I don't know. Either way, the plot gets centralized to these 2 immortals using each other as like insurance plans, since there's a chance that you forget about yourself if you randomly die. In current day, that ended up being the male lead, but they show sometimes where, oh yeah, the female lead also lost her memory sometimes, and it becomes more of like a love story about like companionship than like anything to do with like humanity disappearing, right? And that's kind of a missed opportunity, but other people might prefer it this way anyway, so like it might work for you. Sweeper Swimmer might actually be more interesting because where they're at in the timeline could be debatable, and a good chunk is wondering if everybody they've met in their journey, right, were also immortals, or that they forgot their past and we don't know about it. Most of it is due to them like finding all these tablets and smartphones near the end of their plot. Technically, it's a lot of rotations of the immortals on both plot lines. The Polaris protag was an immortal for like a couple centuries, closer to like a millennia from what I remember. He meets Tsubaki, kills her to verify if she's like an immortal, eventually picks her up, and a lot of stuff happens, and he made her run away whilst making himself a decoy. He dies and forgets. Tsubaki meets Elena after that. Some more time happens, you finally hit Winter Polaris. Tsubaki dies, revives and remembers her past self. The male lead forgot his memories as well, yet again, and the plot becomes about Tsubaki trying to get the male lead back in his old memories. Except you don't know any of this until like chapter 7 or some shit. I'll skip to the next part because it needs a lot of context, but basically she goes off and throws all these like glass bottles with notes into the ocean here and there. Maria offers to bring them around, and she gets shipwrecked, forgets about her own shit, remembers about the bottles. She gets saved by Elena. Elena no longer remembers she's an immortal either, so it's both of them trying to figure out what these bottles are about, and they eventually remember, meet up with Tsubaki. Apparently some of the notes in these bottles were from the male lead, so Tsubaki goes back to like trying to find him as well, since he now remembers again. It's basically just like love letters from both of them. So how many years has it been between Winter Polaris and Swimmer? Who knows? It could honestly be a century. Honestly, I think that's probably one of the cooler things about the title. So like I said before, the tone of this title is pretty dry and somber, and that's kind of his thing, and it scratches a certain itch that not a lot of titles can, because these are still characters that have been living for centuries. Nothing is all that interesting or like exciting once you remember. They're just either going with the flow or secluding themselves. I still prefer Satoguchi stuff, but this guy's also kind of high in my list, more so on like seeing something interesting than actually liking all of stuff. Winter Polaris gives you the bare minimum to keep you going. It lets you infer on what's happening around, and eventually gives you the nugget here and there to like recontextualize. It's very interesting that way. So for Marco, I mentioned before that most of the characters don't really matter, and that everything is basically like the journey is what made it worth it type of thing. You have a goal, you go out to do it, but you'll find all these like little events throughout the way that made it memorable. The allegory was kind of preemptively placed in the part where she's building this gunpla for the mom's kid, but then the kid is like, the fun of the gunpla is actually building, you weirdo, right? Because removing that theme also makes none of this title worthwhile. It's just a lot of like out of nowhere sequences. Out of nowhere there's like an invasion of love, but they all like have calendars for their heads. It's fucking weird. They're aliens, right? And the idea is like, oh, instead of fighting, there's just like an invasive creature, and that eventually controls the whole planet by implanting like happy memories to all the humans. That they're like, oh, we're always doing stuff together, we're friends, we're family, blah blah blah. And Marco and like one other person, I think there's 3 other people, goes around killing them, and eventually kills off like the mom characters. So it leads you to believe like, oh, of course the mom character was dead. Why wouldn't she? This has been like the whole time, and this alien was like just there at the first time. She's like ground zero type shit. But then the mom you meet is actually still alive, so it's just that alien took her image, so you don't know when it was that the alien showed up. You're like, what the fuck, this is kind of stupid now. Out of nowhere, the protagonist has 2 sisters. The idea is that like, oh, the dragon ate all the negatives slash like sad memories from Marco and her mom, yet for some reason that also applied to both of the sisters. You can get why it's wiped for out of like Marco's memories, but what's the point for wiping the 2 sisters from like the mother's memory of that? What the fuck, that's so stupid. And for some reason the 2 sisters still kind of understand like, oh yeah, that's the sisters. Like, why weren't they wiped? This is fucking retarded. It's kind of a theme for a lot of these characters, is like the whole, what was the point of that? And that's why it gave me a lot of like Fooly Cooly vibes, because what was the point of almost anything inside that title? And it's a lot of cool random crap happening that didn't look like it meant much of it, but by the end it was just like, oh, it's a show about this kid going through a lot of shit and maturing to the point that he needed. And that's like the whole thing with this, like, yeah, it's a lot of goofy shit, it doesn't really matter what it is, and the whole thing's like, oh yeah, I had this journey, it was a lot of fun, and everything is an adventure, and their life is an adventure, let's just keep on doing it. And you're like, alright, I get it, but still a lot of this was goofy.